Hello, guys. Welcome back to our second week of notes. I'm Mr. Webker, in case you forgot my face, because it's been so long since I saw you. I'm still at jury duty. This is week two of our Cornell notes. Let me tell you, the hardest part about this is not knowing what to do with my hands. Uh, like Ricky Bobby. I don't know what to do with my hands, but I'm so glad to be able to see you guys and to share with you guys this history. Today we are going into chapter 15. We will be here for 2 weeks. Chapter 15 is about the years before World War II, which means, yes, we're going into World War II for all you crazy war nerds out there. Um, like last week, you are going to be using your PowerPoint guide again as you go through this. Remember, you are taking Cornell notes, and then you're going to highlight in your Cornell notes the answers to your PowerPoint guide, um, and then you will answer in your PowerPoint guide um, the questions. These will be done in complete sentences. Do not waste my time and give me like a really lame yes no answer because I will dock points. I want you guys to be successful. And so this way we can still get some learning done while I'm gone. I know you guys are doing great with Miss Polito, so I thank you so much for being here and for learning about World War II and what led up to World War II with me these next 2 weeks as we go through chapter 15. Our EQ for today is how did the losses of World War One affect people after the war? We're going to have two EQs this week as we're going to go through section one and then section two. Um, we're going to talk about the Great Depression today and just the fear that caused in Europe. We're also going to talk about how that affected the United States, and we're going to go a little bit into the new countries that appeared in Europe after World War One. This is only about 20 slides for the week. We're going to talk about art and literature. Remember, like always, do not write everything down. That'd be a horrible choice. Because if you write everything down, you're wasting paper, you're wasting my time and your time. Summarize, summarize, summarize. That is the key to success in this class. So after World War One, people had a ton of scientific revolutions. Um, Basically, as people left the war, there was a bunch of advances in science and things like guns and weapons. We also had the Industrial Revolution that had just happened, and so science began to explode with ideas. One of the most famous scientists at the time is a guy by the name of Albert Einstein. I'm sure you guys have all heard of him. Albert Einstein was a madman. History always has crazy people in them. It turns out. Albert Einstein, sure enough, was one of them. He had this idea, and he proved it with science, called the theory of relativity, which basically means that everything in the universe is not constant. There's nothing in the universe that is always the same. Stuff is always changing, and so we never do the same thing. For example, the atoms in your body are different than the atoms that were in your body when you were born. Everything in you is newer than when you were born. That's I don't get it. Nerdy, but these ideas began to spark new ideas in philosophy that like if we don't know that everything is always the same, then how do we know that anything is true? And so these ideas begin to birth new ideas in both science and other forms of science. So there's a new form of science that comes out in this time called psychology. Psychology is basically the study of the brain. So people wanted to see why do humans act the way they do. One of the most famous people to do this was called Sigmund Freud. Freud was cool. Basically, he learned that people uh, are only able to do stuff based on what has been done to them. For example, if every time a doorbell ring, I punch you in the face, every time you heard a doorbell, you would begin to get scared, right? Like if you've been punched in the face every time you heard a doorbell, you would always be scared from then on. Freud was a one of the first people to say that everything about us is based on what has happened to us. And so we can understand how to change people by understanding what they have gone through. He says not everybody is the same. And to us, this makes sense, but at the time, this was a brand new idea that nobody had ever heard of. Also, in philosophy, there's this dude named Friedrich Nietzsche. So, Nietzsche is like my favorite dude ever. I could spend all day discussing Nietzsche. So, Nietzsche begins to create these philosophies called existentialism. That's the word on the left side. Existentialism basically means that everything that is true is what you say is true. So he says that there's nothing that makes everything true other than the fact that everybody says it. So, for example, if all the world thought that red was blue, then red is blue. Truth is whatever we say it is, which led him to say that we can make anything good if everybody just believes it was good. So if I can make everybody in the world think that punching babies is good, then under Nietzsche's idea, that would be good. This leads to ideas that create Nazism or the Nazi. So basically, what the Nazis say is then I can take over the world and make everybody agree with me, and therefore it is true. Basically, they thought that whoever has the most power can make stuff true. We sort of say this sometimes when we say the winners write history. So whoever wins the war gets to say what happened. Um, Nietzsche said this about philosophy that whatever is good is what we say is good. And if you're powerful enough to make everybody agree with you, then that is what good is. In art, they begin to think about what is natural and to change that. They said that the world around us is whatever we want it to be. World War One was so crazy that everybody began to say, why do we believe what we believe? And so they made art that reflects that. Some of the forms of art are cubism, which basically says everything in the world is like a shape. So I can make a clock into like an exact circle, or I can make a head into a square. Pablo Picasso did this a lot. If you look up in the left corner, there's a art piece by Picasso, who basically was a cubist artist. And further, there's another form of art called surrealism, which basically makes everything in the world into like a dream or a fantasy. Salvador Dali was one of the most famous. He had survived World War One and said that everything that we see is just bent and distorted and not true. And so he made art that reflects that. His clock image, which is right above me, um, is one of his most famous pieces. He basically says that everything is just a distorted reality. In America, there's a new music style called jazz. Basically, jazz captures these ideas that we are free and we can do whatever we want. It's really nerdy. You don't need to know a lot about it. But what you do need to know is that art changes to be it changes from what is natural to what is true, to what they ever want it to be. So art becomes whatever you want it to be. That's what you need to know about this era is art becomes whatever you want it to be. Further, we see that women are able to take on more jobs in almost every country in the world. During World War One, most men went to war. Same thing happens in World War Two, and so because of this, they need people to work in the factories that were caused by the Industrial Revolution. So while men were at war, women went to work. For example, my grandmother went to work in a orange factory in Redlands, which is just down the street from here, in order to pay the bills for when my grandfather went to war. So this was in the 1920s. But basically, women are able to say, "Hey, if I can work while you're at war, then I can work when you're not at war." There's no difference just because you're at war. And so this begins to create more rights for women. In the United States, you'll learn next year that women also get the right to vote around this time. And women begin to adopt this new style, which allows them to have more freedom. They go from wearing these long conservative dresses to sort of dresses that show like their ankles or their calves, which at the time was very, very, very like judgmental and hoochie mama. Um, But women are able to do this, and oftentimes or sometimes they're able to seek careers. We see some women become lawyers at this time and doctors, which before World War One would have been unheard of. For a woman to do anything other than stay in her house before World War One was almost unheard of. But after World War One, we see a change where women say, "Hey, if I could work in the factory while you were gone, then I sure as heck can work in the factory when you come back." Furthermore, what we see um, during this time, right after World War One, is that machines become mass produced, which means that we can make them very fast. Cars, for example, become one of the first items to be mass produced. A guy by the name of Henry Ford begins to create something called a Model T, which was the first car that was mass produced, and they become so cheap that people can afford to use them. So the average person can buy a car, sort of like today. And so, because of this, people begin to drive cars everywhere. We see an explosion in the use of cars. Also, at the time, airplanes become available and they are able to be used by the wealthy at this time to travel long distances. One of the biggest stars at the time was a man named Charles Lindbergh, who was able to fly his airplane from New York to England. It is the longest flight at the time. He's able to cross the ocean, which was unheard of at the time, and it changes the way we understand transportation and flight. Also, another invention that we see created and used in the 1920s is radio. Radio begins to spread throughout the world, especially in the United States, and it becomes a way to spread news and also to have entertainment. People used to gather around radios the way we gather around TVs to listen to anything from a baseball game to the news to shows at the time. And this was the first form of entertainment that used electronics. Um, Also, a big thing at the time before TVs was motion pictures. So people used to go to theaters and they would watch art really on display. Before um, they had sound, it would be a silent picture where people sort of told a story. Sometimes they had an orchestra at the bottom that played music for them. But sound was introduced in 1927. But the original movies, like the one seen above with Rudolph Valentino, were silent films. Rudolph Valentino was one of the most famous silent film actors. Um, but this was sort of the new entertainment of. Further, literature changed during the 1920s, just like art. Art became this way to express this new truth that everything we see isn't really true and that we can make truth whatever it was. And so men like Kafka wrote in the same way. Kafka is the man at the top. He wrote about how evil the world is, about how everything around him is sad and depressing after World War One. Jay Joyce was sort of the same way, but what he liked to do was he wrote a lot about the human mind, about how the mind can make people do strange things because they believe it is true. So they begin to sort of emphasize the idea that truth is whatever you want it to be. That is going to be the end of our first section of notes. Um, both sections are due on Friday. Remember that. But if you want to call it a day here and pick back up tomorrow or any day before Friday, feel free to do so. We are going to talk about the Great Depression in our second section of notes. The EQ for this section is what happened when the Great Depression spread from the United States throughout the world. We should finish this up in about 6 to 7 minutes at the most. I want to just go over quickly what caused the Depression and how each country reacted to the Great Depression. Um, so we're gonna go from there. After World War One, there were a bunch of little democracies that were created by the war. So basically, they divided up parts of Germany and they made them into little countries um, that really had no experience running their own government, let alone running a democracy. It is really hard to run a democracy. The United States is a democracy, and it is really hard to get all of us to agree on anything. I mean, we have a president that like nobody likes for some reason. And so imagine how hard it is to run a country like that if you've never done it before. We've done it for 300 years and it's hard. Imagine not doing it at all. So many of these governments had something called a coalition government, which basically means that no majority existed. So there was no 50% of people who agreed on anything. And so basically they agreed to work together even though they couldn't agree on anything. And so this caused a lot of issues because nothing could get done in these governments. And so imagine being a business person who wants to invest in these countries, but you feel like if I invest in you, I'm going to lose my money because I don't even know if your government is going to exist long enough to protect me. So if I build a house there and then somebody steals my house, how do I know you're going to protect me? Nobody knew. And so nobody wanted to invest in these new countries. And this creates instability, and it means that there's no money there to grow and to be a strong economy. And so these countries become extremely poor. In Germany, Germany sort of had it harder than anybody after World War One. Basically, because they lost the war, the United States made them pay back everything that everybody had to spend on the war. This was a huge debt. Nobody could afford this debt. Um, and so what Germany did is they followed some bad advice and they just printed more money. The problem with that is that causes a thing called inflation. If you make a lot of money, the money isn't worth anything because everybody has it. If I give everybody $1 million, then it doesn't, you're not special for being a millionaire because everybody has it. And so Germany made so much money that their money was worth nothing. And so the United States tried to help them out with something called the Dawes Plan, which is basically they give a loan and then the Germans pay back that loan. It doesn't help because basically every nation is broke at the time. Because every nation is broke, they decide to sign a treaty called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And basically what that is it's a treaty that says, hey, I don't have enough money to run an army, so I'm not going to have an army, but you can't have an army either. So everyone agrees to not grow their armies so that way they can help their economy. There's a problem here though, because if I'm a crazy leader who happens to be like, I don't know, let's say I had a name that rhymed with trade off Mittler, I don't know, and I saw that nobody else had an army, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to build an army. So even though the Kellogg-Briand Pact said that I will not build an army, I'm going to let you know next week. Nobody follows that. Everybody builds an army anyways, leads to World War II. In the United States, um, we see in this time, 1929, basically what will be the cause of a Great Depression. Um, Everybody in the United States at the time began to spend money on credit. And so the economy is doing great. Everybody has a paycheck. They're like, hey, I can use my credit card because I'll be able to pay back my debt anyways. So they all charge big, expensive radios, refrigerators, you name it, on their credit card, uh, knowing that they will be able to pay it back or thinking they'll be able to pay it back. Um, factory owners um, are hoping that people will buy more stuff, but pretty soon people have bought all they can buy. They've bought all they can buy, and so what this causes is they stop buying stuff, which means that factories no longer need people to make stuff because nobody's buying stuff, and so they lay them off. And then when they get laid off, they can't pay back their loans, and so they begin to lose their houses or their land. Um, Farmers are no longer selling crops that they were selling in World War One, lose their farms, and so basically everyone begins to lose their house and their farms, and this leads to something even crazier on the stock market. People are before the Great Depression, people are buying stocks like crazy. Everybody's buying stocks because they continue to do better and better. If you look at our economy right now, we were having the same issue about 6 months ago, everybody was buying stock because the stock market was going super high. But pretty soon, people have bought more stocks than they can afford, and that causes an issue. Back then, it was even a bigger issue because what people were doing is they were taking their credit cards and buying stock with their credit cards on money they did not have and saying, well, hey, my stock is going to make me money. So if I buy the stock and it becomes more expensive later and then I sell it, I can pay off my credit card. Well, on October 29th, 1929, we see the worst stock crash ever. The prices of the stock drop so low that people cannot pay back their their stock credit because they don't have jobs anyways, and we see what is the Great Depression. Um, it was so bad during the Great Depression that most banks had their money in the stock market, and when the stock market crashed, they couldn't get their money anymore. So when people went to the banks to get their money, guess what? It was gone. There was no money in the bank. So imagine your whole savings is in the bank. They come back the next day, it's not there. The US literally causes the biggest economic failure in the world. After World War One, we were investing in all these other countries, but when our stock market crashed, we couldn't afford to do that anymore, which led to um, the whole world falling into Great Depression. Germany and Austria, which were the losers of the war, sort of have it the worst, but throughout the world, even in the United States, we see the worst depression to ever happen. People are living in shacks. Um, there's not enough food to get by. People struggle during this era. So every country dealt with the Great Depression a little differently, but they all had one fear in common. Almost every country, including the United States, was afraid that communism would take over if they did not deal with the Great Depression well. In Russia, there was a very bad economy, which led to the rise of the Communist Party. And so in other countries, they feared the same thing. The way England dealt with this was by allowing their businesses to slowly get better. They did not, the government did not interfere in the economic recovery at all. They gave sort of a little bit of aid to businesses, but most of it was sort of dealt with by not doing anything extreme. The government said that, hey, if we don't do anything extreme, we will save the democracy. And that's exactly what they did. Excuse me, I'm sorry. That was very successful in England. They sort of rode through the crisis. In the United States, we did not um, we did not avoid having the government help people out. We had a president called Franklin Roosevelt. Basically, what Franklin Roosevelt said is if the government could put everybody to work, then at least they would have money to buy stuff. And so he passed a bill with the help of Congress called the New Deal. And what the New Deal did is basically it put people to work building stuff for the government. So the Hoover Dam, which is out by Las Vegas, was built during this time. Um, roads were built during this time. The national park system, which is like the Grand Canyon, um, different parks throughout the nation, were made during this time, and people were paid to do that, which in turn helped the economy. Our last slide for today is going to talk about how the rest of the world dealt with it. We're really only going to look at two other areas. One is France, the other is Scandinavia. France was able to keep the government together by basically investing in farms. Most people worked on farms at the time. If you look in the lower left corner, you see people working on a farm in France. France was able to use their money from farming um, to rebuild their economy. Scandinavian countries sort of did what the United States did, and their government made jobs for people to work. This is the end of our notes today, so we're really just ending this on the Great Depression. Next week, we are going to look at fascism, which is basically a form of government that Hitler and Mussolini um, created during the Great Depression. which would later cause World War II. So we are super close to World War II. What you need to know is people are dirt broke at the time. The world has basically fallen to pieces, and people are looking for anything to make them feel better. Sadly, some countries look at blaming other people, which will lead to the issues that we have in World War II. Thank you so much for watching this. I am so glad to spend this time with you. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or remind me again. I will be there on Friday. Um, every week we're going to be doing this, so make sure that you have your PowerPoint guide done and your notes done with questions and summaries by Friday when I get there. I will be grading it all. Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys. I know you're rocking it, and I am so proud of you. Have a good week.